In my next two clips, I will discuss the historical context, my interesting thoughts, and the review of Until I Am Free. But I also want to give a background of who the author is. Keisha N. Blaine is an American writer and also is a professor of African Studies and History at Brown University. She was also the president of African American Intellectual History Society from 2017 to 2021. She graduated from Princeton University and is a best-selling author. Until I Am Free is an exceptional book, and in my next clip you will see as to why I think that and some passages of what I thought was interesting and touching. Before I get into the review of Until I Am Free by Keisha N. Blaine, I want to give historical context and some highlights of the book as I was reading. During this time, the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War were major things in these years. The years were 1960s and the 1970s. The Civil Rights Movement specifically was a major thing. During this time, the Jim Crow South was happening and Jim Crow laws were being enacted, specifically voting rights. Although there was a constitutional amendment saying that African Americans could vote and they had the right to vote, this was not happening in the South. There were literacy tests, grandfather clause. There were a lot of things to stop African Americans from voting. But in the book, we can see that this was not being stopped, even though white people were really trying to. In the book, you can see that Fannie Lou Hamer took her and 18 other black residents and tried to register to vote. Although it was unsuccessful, they did try. That was a big highlight in the book, was the initiative, the advocating part of this book, just seeing how one person could advocate like this, gather people around her and show that, hey, this is a real problem, this needs to be fixed, and actually see some change throughout the years is extraordinary. Specifically, there was one passage that talked about how when she was in Africa, she basically was, her descendants were stripped away from Africa and brought to America to be basically for the white people. That was the whole cause. They wanted someone to do the work for them, and they brought African Americans over to do it for them. And she talks about how angry she is and how she was stripped away from her descendants. She has no idea. She could have been walking next to someone and had no idea she was related to that person. And that was very, not only interesting, but touching to see the anger, but also kind of a hopefulness that she might be walking next to one of her descendants. And that's an amazing thing to see, that there's still a long line of people of her descendants. But overall, the story and this entirety of the book was very interesting, and I'm very glad I was able to read it. Now, next I will do my review of Until I Am Free. Thank you. Until I Am Free by Keisha N. Blaine explores how Fannie Lou Hamer changed the political and activist landscape of the Civil Rights Movement. In my review, I will revisit each chapter and give an overview as to how Hamer took on several issues. To start with, Chapter 1 gives a biography of who Hamer is and how she came to be a part of such an influential movement. Fannie Lou Hamer came from a sharecropper family. At the age of 2, like many other black families, Hamer's family moved to Sunflower County, Mississippi, as a part of the Great Migration. From a very early age, she helped her dad and mom pick whatever crop there was to pick. Although Hamer valued the time she spent in school, she had very little school time hours due to the financial need of being on the farm to help support their family. From an early age, Hamer witnessed the Jim Crow South firsthand, and although it was a very difficult time, her family tried to make a loving and supportive household the best they could. As Hamer became older, she married her husband, Pap, although this was not her first husband. But the author explains that Hamer did not speak much on her first husband due to her image, and the act of adultery would ruin that. Her and Pap were in love, and Pap would even be known to help Hamer in her activist business in years to come. On page 13, Blaine explains the event that changed Hamer's life forever in 1962. That summer, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee arrived in Louisville, Mississippi. Blaine goes on to explain on page 113, on Saturday, October 26, 1962, Hamer's pastor, Reverend J.D. Story, had announced plans for a mass meeting to be held at the church the next day. Although Hamer was at first reluctant to attend, the prodding of her close friend, Mary Tucker, convinced Hamer to reconsider her decision to skip the meeting. In this meeting, the activists of the SNCC tried to encourage the Black residents to register to vote. This was something Hamer had no idea they were allowed to do. She had no idea about the constitutional amendment set in place to allow them to register to vote. But due to the Jim Crow South, this was not possible. This night transformed her and all of her ideas on the Jim Crow South and the Jim Crow laws. Chapter 2 explains the first of Fannie Hamer's activism, and the author also ties it together with the problem of state-sanctioned violence. Hamer did not take no time into putting her foot in the door of activism. She and 18 other Black residents from Sunflower County volunteered to register to vote in Mississippi. Of course, with anything that Black residents tried to do, they were met with police officers before they could even step foot in the courthouse. Hamer was faced with one of the literacy tests that was a part of the Jim Crow laws and flunked it due to the little schooling she had during her childhood years and not knowing anything about the constitutional amendments that they made Hamer read. As they left the courthouse, they were not only stopped by police officers before getting on the bus, they were stopped on the way home and fined for driving the wrong color bus. This in part shows how state-sanctioned violence and how police officers in general targeted Black people for anything under the sun. This confrontation with the police had her and her husband fired from their plantation and were forced to give back their car and their house. But this did not stop Fannie Hamer. Blaine also explains a very heartbreaking but very real incident that happened to Hamer and thousands of other Black residents: forced sterilization. In the Jim Crow South, if doctors saw that a resident was unfit to parent children, they would perform a forced sterilization without the woman's consent. This happened not only to Hamer, but to many other minority residents. Hamer was the first person to openly address this issue. In all of the chapters, Blaine addresses a more recent issue with what Hamer not only had to deal with, but advocated for during her time. Blaine does this to show how these issues not only are still happening today, but are being advocated for at even a higher level thanks to social media. Chapter 3 at first discusses a police wrongful murder that happened in March of 2020, and how the outcry and movement of this murder boomed overnight due to a hashtag. But more than that, the movement explains the aspect of leaders and how these people in 2020 not only wanted them, but Hamer in the 1960s wanted them as well. But Hamer did not just want any leader. She wanted someone group-centered. A leader who had the greatest impact on her was Ella Baker. Ella Baker was a part of many organizations, but she mainly helped create the SNCC. Baker wanted group-centered leadership, and that is what Hamer loved. Hamer openly worshipped leaders like Baker and even criticized the ones that failed to live up to their expectations in their roles. Chapter 3 then goes on to explain how Hamer was fighting for a people's Mississippi. Hamer saw the injustice in Mississippi and saw what change needed to be done. Mississippi was mainly black, but somehow, in some way, thanks to Jim Crow laws, the white population ruled the state. Chapter 4 then goes on to the topic of feminism. This topic was an interesting one to read because of Hamer's view. Yes, Hamer did support feminists, and she did want to see women have the same rights as men, but she was advocating for more than that. Blaine mentions many times how Hamer didn't just want women's rights, but she wanted rights for everyone, no matter if you were black or white or a woman or men, she advocated for you. Chapter 5 shows how Hamer's trip to Africa was such an influential trip. Hamer was mesmerized from the point of stepping onto the plane with a black pilot all the way up until heading back to America. She felt a closeness to the people of Africa, although she was not able to speak their language. But she was also angry. She was angry at the fact she couldn't speak their language. She was angry at the fact she could be standing in front of a distant relative and never know it. She was also angry at the people who stripped her and her descendants from their land for the benefit of the whites and only the whites. The final chapter, Chapter 6, looks into the views of poverty. Living in Mississippi, like many other black residents, Hamer knew what poverty was and saw the need for change. Although this was a major task since the United States has one of the biggest poverty problems despite being the richest country, Hamer sought out for change. Specifically, she started Freedom Farm, which Blaine explains on page 111, a community-based rural and economic development project as a strategy for tackling poverty in Mississippi during the late 1960s and 1970s. Hamer was not afraid to speak out on the poverty situation either. She even tried to run against a politician who sought to make sure aid for poverty was given to the richer white people rather than poor people. This was also a major thing for Hamer. She was not just seeking help for black residents. She was seeking help for poor white residents also. This entire book was very interesting. How Hamer could advocate for everyone and not just one person, one gender, or one race is very influential. Hamer was a person of equality, and up until her last breath, she advocated for everyone.